Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second part of my reading of The Dead Man's Tale by Willard E. Hawkins. This is the first story that was published in the first issue of Weird Tales, the magazine that we know and love for the production of spooky, scary stories back in the early 1920s and beyond. This story, if you remember from last time, is about the main character Richard Devaney, who is in World War I, and he plans to kill his friend Louis Winston over a woman. However, just before Richard can pull the trigger, he himself is killed by a shard of shrapnel hitting him in the head. He dies, but he discovers that he's not going anywhere. He remains as a ghost, and his savage jealousy for Louis and their mutual love for the woman Velma is the motivation for him to continue his actions here on Earth. At the end of the first part, which came out last week, he said this: "Here I was in a state of being that the world calls death, while Louis lived, was free to return home, to claim Velma, to flaunt his possession of all that I held precious. It was maddening. Must I stand idly by, helpless to prevent this? Well, in this episode we'll find that he is not entirely helpless." The Dead Man's Tale by Willard E. Hawkins. 3. I have wondered since how I could remain so long in touch with the objective world, why I did not at once or very soon find myself shut off from earthly sights and sounds, as those in physical form are shut off from the things beyond. The matter seems to have been determined by my will. Like weights of lead, envy of Louis and passionate longing for Velma held my feet to the sphere of dense matter. Vengeful, despairing, I watched beside Louis. When at last he turned away from my body and, with tears streaming from his eyes, began to drag a useless leg toward the trenches we had left, I realized why he had not gone on with the others to the crest of the hill. He, too, was a victim of Boche gunnery. I walked beside the stretcher-bearers when they had picked him up and were conveying him toward the base hospital. Throughout the weeks that followed, I hovered near his cot, watching the doctors as they bound up the lacerated tendons in his thigh, and missing no detail of his battle with the fever. Over his shoulder I read the first letter he wrote home to Velma, in which he gave a belated account of my death, dwelling upon the glory of my sacrifice. "I have often thought that you two were meant for each other," he wrote, "and that if it had not been for fear of hurting me, you would have been his wife long ago. He was the best buddy a man ever had. If only I could have been the one to die. Had I known it, I could have followed this letter across seas, could, in fact, have passed it, and by an exercise of the will, have been at Velma's side in the twinkling of an eye. But my ignorance of the laws of the new plane was total. All my thoughts were centered upon a problem of entirely different character. Never was hold upon earthly treasure more reluctantly relinquished than was my hope of possessing Velma. Surely death could not erect so absolute a barrier. There must be a way, some loophole of communication, some chance for a disembodied man to contend with his corporeal rival for a woman's love. Slowly, very slowly, dawned the light of a plan. So feeble was the glimmer that it would scarcely have comforted one in less desperate straits. But to me it appeared to offer a possible hope. I set about methodically, with infinite patience, evolving it into something tangible, even though I had but the most indefinite idea of what the outcome might be. The first suggestion came when Louis had so far recovered that but little trace of the fever remained. One afternoon, as he lay sleeping, the mail distributor handed a letter to the nurse who happened to be standing beside his cot. She glanced at it, then tucked it under his pillow. The letter was from Velma, and I was hungry for the contents. I did not then know that I could have read it easily, sealed though it was. In a frenzy of impatience, I exclaimed, "Wake up, confound it, and read your letter!" With a start, he opened his eyes. He looked around with a bewildered expression. "Under your pillow," I fumed. "Look under your pillow." In a dazed manner, he put his hand under the pillow and drew forth the letter. A few hours later, I heard him commenting on the experience to the nurse. "Something seemed to wake me up," he said. and I had a peculiar impulse to feel under the pillow. It was just as if I knew I would find the letter there. The circumstances seemed as remarkable to me as it did to him. It might be a coincidence, but I determined to make a further test. A series of experiments convinced me that I could, to a very slight degree, impress my thoughts and will upon Louis, especially when he was tired or on the borderland of sleep. Occasionally I was able to control the direction of his thoughts as he wrote home to Velma. On one occasion he was describing for her a funny little Frenchwoman who visited the hospital, with a basket that was always filled with cigarettes and candy. Last time, he wrote, she brought with her a boy whom she called... He paused, with pencil upraised, trying to recall the name. A moment later he looked down at the page and stared with astonishment. The words, "She called him Maurice," had been added below the unfinished line. "I must be going daffy," he muttered. "I'd swear I didn't write that." Behind him I stood rubbing my hands in triumph. It was my first successful effort to guide the pencil while his thoughts strayed elsewhere. Another time he wrote to Velma, "I have a strange feeling lately that dear old Dick is near. Sometimes as I wake up, I seem to remember vaguely having seen him in my dreams. It's as if his features were just fading from view." He paused here so long that I made another attempt to take advantage of his abstraction. By an effort of the will that it is difficult to explain, I guided his hand into the formation of the words, "With a jug full of kisses for Winky, as ever her." Just then Louis looked down. "Good God!" he exclaimed, as if he had seen a ghost. 4. Winky was a pet name I had given Velma when we were children together. Louis always maintained there was no sense in it, and refused to adopt it, though I frequently called her by the name in later years. And of his own volition, Louis would never have mentioned anything so convivial as a jug full of kisses. So, through the weary months before he was invalided home, I worked. When he left France at the debarkation point, he still walked on crutches, but with the promise of regaining the unassisted use of his leg before very long. Throughout the voyage I hovered near him, sharing his impatience, his longing for the one we both held dearest. Over the exquisite pain of the reunion, at which I was present yet not present, I shall pass briefly. More beautiful than ever, more appealing with her vivid deep coloring, Velma in the flesh was a vision that stirred my longing into an intense flame. Louis limped painfully down the gangplank. When they met, she rested her head silently on his shoulder for a moment, then, her eyes brimming with tears, assisted him, with the tender solicitude of a mother, to the machine she had in waiting. 2 months later they were married. I felt the pain of this less deeply than I would have done had it not been essential to my designs. Whatever vague hope I may have had, however, of vicariously enjoying the delights of love were disappointed. I could not have explained why. I only knew that something barred me from intruding upon the sacred intimacies of their life, as if a defensive wall were interposed. It was baffling, but a very present fact, against which I found it useless to rebel. I have since learned, but no matter. This had no bearing on my purpose, which hinged upon the ability I was acquiring, of influencing Louis's thoughts and actions, of taking partial control of his faculties. The occupation into which he drifted, restricted in choice as he was by the stiffened leg, helped me materially. Often, after an interminable shift at the bank, he would plod home at night with brains so weary and benumbed that it was a simple matter to impress my will upon him. Each successful attempt, too, made the next one easier. The inevitable consequence was that in time Velma should notice his aberrations and betray concern. "Why did you say to me, when you came in last night, 'There's a blue billy goat on the stairs, I wish they'd drive him out'?" she demanded one morning. He looked down shamefacedly at the tablecloth. "I don't know what made me say it. I seemed to want to say it, and that was the only way to get it off my mind. I thought you'd take it as a joke." He shifted his shoulders as if trying to dislodge an unpleasant burden. "And was that what made you wear a necktie to bed?" she asked, ironically. He nodded in affirmative. I knew it was idiotic, but the idea kept running in my mind. It seemed as if the only way I could go to sleep was to give in to it. I don't have these freaks unless I'm very tired. She said nothing more at the time, but that evening she broached the subject of his looking for an opening in some less sedentary occupation, a subject to which she thereafter constantly recurred. Then came a development that surprised and excited me with its possibilities. Exhausted, drained to the last drop of his nerve force, Louis was returning late one night from the bank, following the usual month-end overtime grind. As he walked from the car line, I hovered over him, subduing his personality, forcing it under control, with the effort of will I had gradually learned to direct upon him. The process can only be explained in a crude way. It was as if I contended with him, sometimes successfully, for possession of the steering wheel of the human car that he drove. Velma was waiting when we arrived. As Louis's feet sounded on the threshold of their apartment, she opened the door, caught his hands, and drew him inside. At the action, I felt inexplicably thrilled. It was as if some marvelous change had come over me. And then, as I met her gaze, I knew what that change was. I held her hands in real flesh and blood contact. I was looking at her with Louis's sight. So, Richard has learned that he does have a little bit of ability to have an effect on the real world. He does have some ability to influence Louis. But how far does that power extend, and can he use it in some way to assuage his savage envy? Well, we'll find out next time, in the next couple of chapters of The Dead Man's Tale by Willard E. Hawkins, next week. See you all next time.